The woman kneeling beside the weathered grave marker didn't notice she was being watched, her fingers gently pressing seeds into the dry Montana earth, as though tending something precious. Nessa Pearson had found the forgotten burial plot 3 days ago while wandering the hills beyond Central City, and something about the lonely stone with its faded inscription had gripped her heart and refused to let go. The gravestone reads simply, Sarah Mae, 1849–1873. Beloved. Nothing more. No family name, no epitaph beyond that single word that now seemed heartbreakingly inadequate. Nessa had spent the first afternoon clearing away years of weeds and accumulated dirt, her hands raw and blistered by the time she finished. The second day she'd brought water from the creek and scrubbed the stone until those carved letters emerged clearly again. Today, she carried wildflower seeds collected from the meadows near her boarding house, determined to give Sarah Mae the beauty she deserved. Those will take until next spring to bloom, a deep voice said behind her. Nessa startled so badly she dropped the cloth pouch of seeds. She twisted around, heart hammering, to find a man on horseback watching her from perhaps 20 feet away. He sat easy in the saddle, his posture relaxed despite the intensity of his gaze. Dust covered his boots and the legs of his denim trousers, and his hat cast shadows across a face weathered by sun and wind. Even from this distance, she could see his eyes were a striking green. "I didn't hear you approach," Nessa said, pressing a hand to her chest. Her heart still raced beneath her palm. "Didn't mean to startle you," the man said. He dismounted with fluid grace and removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that needed cutting. "This is my land you're on." Fear flickered through Nessa. She'd asked around town about who owned these hills, but the answers had been vague. Most folks seemed to think this particular stretch belonged to no one, forgotten and unused. "I apologize. I didn't realize I can leave." "Didn't say you had to leave." He took a step closer, his eyes moving from her face to the grave and then to the freshly turned earth around it. Something shifted in his expression, softening the hard lines around his mouth. "I'm asking what you're doing." "Planting wildflowers," Nessa said simply. She bent to retrieve her fallen seed pouch, brushing dirt from the fabric. For Sarah Mae, it seemed wrong that no one tends her grave. "You knew her?" "No." Nessa turned back to the gravestone, running her fingers over the carved letters. "I found this place by accident. I like to walk in the afternoons, and I wandered farther than usual. When I saw how neglected it was, I just couldn't bear it. Everyone deserves to be remembered." The man was silent for a long moment. When Nessa glanced back at him, she found him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. His jaw was tight and his hands gripped his hat so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Did you know her?" Nessa asked quietly. "Sarah Mae, my sister," he said, the words rough. "She died of fever 7 years ago. I buried her here because she loved this spot. Used to come up here and sit for hours watching the valley." Nessa's breath caught. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude on something private." "No." He shook his head, his green eyes meeting hers with surprising warmth. "No, you didn't intrude. I'm ashamed, truth be told. I haven't been up here in over a year, maybe longer. I kept meaning to, but the ranch demands everything, and I let myself forget." He looked away toward the distant mountains. "You're a better person than me, taking care of a stranger's grave." "I'm sure you have your reasons," Nessa said. "Running a ranch is demanding work, at least that's what I understand. I'm fairly new to Montana." "Where are you from?" "Pennsylvania. Philadelphia specifically." "I came west 3 months ago." Nessa brushed dirt from her skirt, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. Her dark blonde hair had escaped its pins, and soil streaked her sleeves. "I needed a fresh start." "Fair enough." Most folks who come this far west are running from something or towards something, sometimes both. He extended his hand. Kieran Sullivan. I own the Bar S Ranch about 3 miles southeast of here. Nessa shook his hand, noting the calluses and strength in his grip. Nessa Pearson. I'm staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house in Central City. I work at the general store, Morrison's place. Yes, that's right, Kieran nodded, settling his hat back on his head. Good man, Morrison, fair prices, honest dealings. He looked back at the grave, his expression contemplating. Would you mind if I helped? With the planting, I mean. I'd like that very much, Nessa said, surprised by how much she meant it. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Kieran's larger hands making quick work of turning the soil while Nessa followed behind, pressing seeds into the prepared earth. The afternoon sun beat down warm on their backs, and meadowlarks sang in the distance. Nessa found herself stealing glances at the rancher, noting the way he moved with careful purpose, how gentle his hands were despite their obvious strength. She would have liked you, Kieran said eventually, breaking the silence. Sarah, I mean. She had a soft heart like yours, always bringing home injured animals or befriending the outcasts in town. What was she like? Nessa asked. If you don't mind me asking. Kieran sat back on his heels, gazing at the gravestone with an expression of mingled sadness and affection. Stubborn as a mule, for one thing. 3 years younger than me, but she never let me boss her around. She could outride most men and wasn't afraid of hard work, but she was kind too, really kind in a way that's rare. He paused, his voice growing rougher. When the fever took her, it was fast. 3 days from first symptom to the end. I couldn't do anything to help. The doctor said it was one of those things that nothing could have stopped it, but I've always wondered. You can't blame yourself, Nessa said softly. Sometimes we lose people and there's no reason for it. No explanation that makes sense. It's just cruel chance. Speaking from experience. Nessa nodded, returning her attention to the seeds in her hand. My younger brother died 2 years ago in a factory accident. He was only 16. I keep thinking about all the moments I took for granted. All the times I was too busy or too tired to really listen when he wanted to talk. You never think you'll run out of time until suddenly you have. I'm sorry, Kieran said, and the simple sincerity in his voice brought unexpected tears to Nessa's eyes. Thank you. She blinked them back, focusing on the task at hand. That's part of why I left Philadelphia. Everything there reminded me of Thomas. His favorite corner where he'd read, the street where he'd walk to work, the church where we held his funeral. I needed to go somewhere that didn't echo with his absence. And you chose Montana. Despite the heaviness of their conversation, Nessa found herself smiling. I saw an advertisement for teachers wanted out west. I'd been teaching at a small school in Philadelphia, and it seemed like a sign. But when I arrived in Central City, I discovered they'd already filled the position. Mr. Morrison was kind enough to offer me work at his store until another teaching opportunity comes along. Are you planning to stay? In Montana, I mean. Nessa met his eyes, struck again by their unusual color and the directness of his gaze. I think so. There's something about this place that feels right. The sky seems bigger here, and the land has a kind of wild beauty that calls to something in me I didn't know existed. Kieran smiled, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to genuinely striking. I know exactly what you mean. I was born in Colorado, but we moved here when I was 12. Never wanted to leave. This land gets into your blood. They finished planting as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Nessa brushed dirt from her hands and stood, surveying their work with satisfaction. The earth around Sarah Mae's grave looked tended now, loved, ready to burst into color come spring. "Thank you for letting me do this," Nessa said, "and for helping. It means a lot." "I should be thanking you," Kieran replied. He gathered his horse's reins, stroking the animal's nose absently. "You did something I should have done years ago. You honored my sister's memory when her own brother neglected it." "You haven't neglected her," Nessa said firmly. "You're here now. That's what matters." Kieran studied her for a long moment, something warm and wondering in his expression. "Can I ride you back to town? It's getting late and these hills aren't safe after dark. We've had reports of mountain lions in the area. I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition. Besides, my horse is strong enough to carry two, and it'll be faster than walking." He held out his hand to her, and after only a moment's hesitation, Nessa took it. Being helped onto the horse brought her close enough to Kieran to smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. Her heart did an unexpected flutter as she settled behind the saddle, uncertain where to put her hands until Kieran reached back and guided them to his waist. "Hold on," he said simply. And then they were moving. The ride into Central City took about 40 minutes, the horse moving at an easy pace over the rough terrain. Nessa found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it, acutely aware of the warmth of Kieran's body and the solid strength of him beneath her hands. He rode with unconscious skill, guiding the horse around obstacles and keeping the gait smooth. "You come into town often?" Nessa asked, partly to distract herself from the unsettling feelings his proximity stirred in her. "Once, maybe twice a week for supplies," Kieran replied. "I have 2 ranch hands who help with the day-to-day work, but I do most of the business dealings myself. Can't afford to hire a foreman right now." "How large is your ranch?" "About 2,000 acres. Not huge by Montana standards, but big enough to keep me busy. I run cattle mostly with some horses. It was my father's place. He died 5 years back, left it to Sarah and me. When she passed, it became mine alone." There was loneliness in his voice that Nessa recognized, an echo of her own isolation. She tightened her grip slightly at his waist, a gesture of comfort, and felt him respond by covering one of her hands briefly with his own. They rode into Central City just as the street lamps were being lit. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined by storefronts and businesses that served the surrounding ranches and mines. Morrison's General Store sat near the center, its windows already dark for the evening. Kieran guided his horse past it to the boarding house 2 streets over, a neat 2-story building painted white with blue trim. "Here you are," Kieran said, bringing the horse to a stop. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Nessa down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and he lowered her to the ground with care. For a moment they stood close, his hands lingering at her waist, her palms resting on his shoulders. The air between them felt charged somehow, full of possibility. "Thank you for the ride," Nessa said softly, reluctant to step back, "and for trusting me with Sarah's story." "Will you go back?" Kieran asked. "To the grave, I mean, to check on the flowers." "Yes," Nessa said. "I'd like to see them bloom in the spring. Then I'll see you there." Kieran's green eyes held hers for a long moment. "If that's all right with you." "I'd like that very much." Kieran smiled, that transformative expression that made her breath catch. He tipped his hat to her and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. "Good night, Nessa Pearson." "Good night, Kieran Sullivan." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the evening shadows. Only when he was completely out of sight did she turn and enter the boarding house, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. Mrs. Chen, the boarding house proprietor, looked up from her knitting as Nessa entered the parlor. The older woman was Chinese, one of the few who'd stayed in Central City after the railroad construction ended. She ran her establishment with firm kindness and had been unfailingly good to Nessa since her arrival. "You are late this evening," Mrs. Chen observed, her English accented but clear. "I was beginning to worry." "I'm sorry. I was up in the hills and lost track of time." Nessa removed her bonnet, aware of how wild her hair must look. "A kind rancher gave me a ride back." Mrs. Chen's dark eyes sharpened with interest. "A rancher? What rancher?" "Kieran Sullivan. He owns the Bar S Ranch." "Ah." Mrs. Chen set down her knitting, her expression approving. "Good man, that one. Honest, hard-working. His father was the same, very sad about his sister. He told me about her," Nessa said. "I've been tending her grave." "That is a kind thing to do." Mrs. Chen rose, smoothing her dark skirt. "Are you hungry? I saved you some supper." "Thank you, but I'm more tired than hungry. I think I'll just go to bed." "Sleep well, then. Tomorrow is Saturday. Will you still walk in the hills?" Nessa thought of Kieran's smile, the way his hands had felt at her waist, the warmth in his eyes when he'd talked about seeing her again. "Yes," she said. "I think I will." Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Nessa would spend her mornings working at Morrison's general store, helping customers and managing inventory. Her afternoons were her own, and she'd walk up into the hills to Sarah Mae's grave, tending the plot and watching for the first signs of growth. More often than not, she'd find Kieran there, or he'd arrive shortly after she did. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about ranch life, about the challenges of keeping cattle healthy through the harsh Montana winters, about his hopes of expanding his herd. She told him about Philadelphia, about teaching children who came to school with empty bellies and tired eyes, about her family and the brother she still missed with an ache that never fully faded. Sometimes they worked in comfortable silence, Kieran clearing stones from around the grave while Nessa pulled the occasional weed. Other times they'd sit on the hillside and simply talk, watching the valley below as the afternoon light turned golden. Nessa found herself looking forward to these meetings with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd come west to escape grief, not to find love, yet here was this man who made her heart race and her spirit feel lighter. It was mid-November, nearly 6 weeks after their first meeting, when Kieran finally made his intentions clear. They'd been sitting on the hillside, wrapped in coats against the increasing cold. The first snow had already fallen and melted, but more was coming. Everyone in town spoke of the hard winter ahead. "The ground will freeze soon," Kieran said, his breath misting in the cold air. "You won't be able to come up here much longer." "I know," Nessa said, feeling an unexpected pang at the thought. These afternoon meetings had become the center of her days, the moments she cherished most. "Spring seems very far away." "Nessa." Kieran turned to face her, his expression serious. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it without sounding like a fool." Her heart began to pound. "You could never sound foolish. Don't be so sure." He managed a small smile, but his eyes remained intense. "The truth is, I've been coming up here not just for Sarah's sake, but for yours, to see you, to talk with you. These past weeks have been the best I've had in years, and it's because of you." "Kieran." His name came out as barely more than a whisper. "I know we haven't known each other long," he continued, the words coming faster now as though he feared losing his nerve. "And I know you came here to start over, not to be courted by some rancher with dirt under his nails. But I can't help how I feel. You've brought light back into my life, Nessa. You've reminded me that there's more to living than just surviving. When I'm with you, I feel like myself again. Like the man I used to be before I lost everyone I loved." Nessa reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You're not alone in feeling this way. I've been looking forward to seeing you every day. When I wake up in the morning, my first thought is whether you'll be here." You've become important to me, Kieran, more important than I knew was possible in such a short time. Then can I court you properly? He asked. Can I take you to dinner in town, introduce you to my ranch hands, show you the life I'm offering? Yes, Nessa said, smiling through sudden tears. Yes to all of it. Kieran cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her cheeks. I'm going to kiss you now, if that's all right. In answer, Nessa leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers softly at first, tentative, as though she were something precious that might break. But when she responded, pressing closer, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise and the beginning of something real. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed with more than cold. Well, Kieran said, his voice rough with emotion, that was worth the wait. Nessa laughed, a sound of pure joy. It certainly was. They stayed on the hillside until the sun began to set, talking about the future now with a new openness. Kieran spoke of his hopes for the ranch, of the house that needed a woman's touch, of his dream of building something lasting. Nessa shared her own hopes, her desire to teach again, her wish to belong somewhere in a way she never had in Philadelphia. The school board is meeting next month about opening a second school on the west side of town, Kieran mentioned as they finally rose to leave. The mining company is bringing in more families and the current schoolhouse is overcrowded. You should apply for the position. I didn't know about that, Nessa said, excitement stirring. How did you hear? One of my ranch hands has a brother on the school board. I could put in a word for you if you'd like. I'd appreciate that very much. Kieran helped her onto his horse, swinging up behind her this time so his arms bracketed her body as he took the reins. The ride back to town felt different now, charged with new meaning. Nessa leaned back against his chest and his arms tightened around her waist. I have to go to Butte City next week for a cattle auction, Kieran said as they neared town. I'll be gone 4 or 5 days. Will you think of me while I'm away? Every moment, Nessa promised. True to his word, Kieran began courting her in earnest. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the finest establishment Central City had to offer. He introduced her to his ranch hands, 2 weathered cowboys named Pete and Jim who treated her with courteous respect. He showed her around the Bar S ranch, pointing out the improvements he'd made and the ones he still planned. The ranch house itself was a sprawling single-story structure built of logs and stone, sturdy and practical but lacking in warmth. The furniture was sparse and masculine, the walls bare except for a few faded photographs. But Nessa could see its potential, could imagine curtains on the windows and rugs on the floors, could picture herself making a home here. It's wonderful, she told Kieran as they stood in the main room, a stone fireplace dominating one wall. It has good bones. But it needs work, Kieran said. I know it's not much to look at right now. It's honest, Nessa replied. Like you. And that's worth more than any amount of fancy decoration. December arrived with heavy snows that blanketed the valley and made travel difficult. Nessa couldn't visit Sarah Mae's grave anymore, the hillside trails too treacherous to risk. But Kieran came into town nearly every day, braving the cold to see her. They'd sit in the parlor of the boarding house, Mrs. Chen knitting nearby as a proper chaperone, and talk for hours. Sometimes he'd bring her small gifts, nothing expensive but chosen with care. A book of poetry he thought she'd enjoy, a pair of warm gloves lined with rabbit fur, a hair comb carved from bone with tiny flowers etched into the surface. You're spoiling me, Nessa protested when he presented her with a beautiful wool shawl the color of cranberries. I'm courting you, Kieran corrected, draping the shawl around her shoulders. There's a difference. Besides, I like seeing you smile. As Christmas approached, Nessa received news that transformed her prospects. The school board had approved the new schoolhouse and offered her the teaching position, to begin after the new year. The salary was modest but fair, and it came with a small cottage near the school for her use. "They want me to start in January," Nessa told Kieran excitedly when he arrived that evening. "I'll have my own classroom, my own students. It's everything I hoped for." "That's wonderful," Kieran said, and his happiness for her was genuine. But there was something else in his expression, a shadow that hadn't been there before. "What's wrong?" Nessa asked. "Nothing's wrong. I'm happy for you, truly." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "But I need to ask you something, and I'm afraid of the answer." "You can ask me anything." Kieran took a deep breath, his green eyes searching hers. "Does this job mean you'll want to wait? Before we take the next step, I mean. I understand if you need time to establish yourself in your career. I know teaching means a lot to you. What next step?" Nessa asked, though her heart was already racing because she thought she knew. Instead of answering with words, Kieran reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a gold ring set with a single small diamond that caught the lamplight and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. "This was my mother's," Kieran said softly. "It's not much, but it's real. Like what I feel for you." He slid from his chair to kneel before her, still holding the box. "Nessa Pearson, I love you. I think I started loving you the first moment I saw you tending a grave for a woman you'd never met, showing kindness to a stranger's memory. You've brought joy back into my life, given me reasons to hope again. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down Nessa's face, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you." Kieran's hands shook slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Then he was rising, pulling her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, Mrs. Chen was beaming at them from her chair, her knitting abandoned. "About time," the older woman said with satisfaction. "I was beginning to think you would never ask." They were married on a cold, bright day in late December, just before Christmas. The ceremony took place in Central City's small church, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Morrison gave Nessa away, having become something of a father figure to her. Pete and Jim served as Kieran's groomsmen, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday best. Mrs. Chen wept openly, and even the stern-faced minister cracked a smile at the joy radiating from the couple. Nessa wore a dress of deep blue wool that she'd made herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Kieran wore a new black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his green eyes even more striking. When he said his vows, his voice was strong and clear, full of emotion that made Nessa's heart swell. Her own voice shook only slightly as she promised to love and honor him for the rest of her life. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said, and Kieran did, thoroughly and enthusiastically, to the cheers and applause of everyone present. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel, a simple but hearty meal that perfectly suited the occasion. Nessa found herself laughing more than she had in years, surrounded by people who'd come to feel like family. Morrison gave a rambling but heartfelt speech about how Nessa had brought sunshine to his store and how Kieran was lucky to have found her. Mrs. Chen presented them with an exquisite hand-embroidered quilt as a wedding gift, the stitching so fine it made Nessa gasp. "For your marriage bed," Mrs. Chen said. "May it keep you warm through many winters." As the afternoon waned, Kieran leaned close to Nessa and whispered, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan." The name sent a thrill through her. Very ready. They rode out to the Bar S ranch through snow-covered landscape that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Kieran had tied bells to the horses' harness, and they jingled merrily as they traveled. When they crested the final hill and the ranch house came into view, Nessa drew in a sharp breath. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed warm in the windows. Pete and Jim got the fires going and lit the lamps before they headed back to their cabin, Kieran explained. They wanted you to come home to a warm house. Home. The word settled into Nessa's chest with perfect rightness. This was home now. Not the boarding house, not the cottage by the school, but here with Kieran. He helped her down from the horse and swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protests. Inside, the house had been transformed. Evergreen branches festooned the mantel, filling the air with their crisp scent. Someone had brought in furniture from somewhere, adding comfortable chairs and a small table. A fire roared in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "Welcome home," Kieran said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "It's perfect," Nessa whispered. "Everything is perfect." They made supper together in the kitchen, working side by side to prepare a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold chicken left by the thoughtful ranch hands. They ate at the small table, hands clasped between them, speaking little but saying everything with looks and touches. Afterward, Kieran led her to the bedroom, where Mrs. Chen's quilt lay spread across the bed, and more lamplight cast a golden glow. "Are you nervous?" he asked softly, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "A little," Nessa admitted. "But mostly I'm happy. So happy I can hardly believe this is real." "It's real," Kieran assured her. He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "And I'm going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret this," Nessa said. She reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite her racing heart. "I love you, Kieran Sullivan, with everything I am." "And I love you, Nessa Sullivan." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and they came together as husband and wife with tenderness and passion, sealing their vows in the most intimate way possible. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in white, but inside they were warm, wrapped in each other and the beginning of their life together. The next months passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Nessa began teaching at the new schoolhouse in January, finding deep satisfaction in working with her students. Most were children of miners and ranchers, hungry for learning and respectful of her authority. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, loving every challenging moment. Living at the ranch while teaching in town required careful organization. Kieran drove her to school each morning before dawn, then returned to pick her up in the late afternoon. On days when weather was too severe for the journey, she'd stay at the school cottage, though she missed Kieran terribly those nights. He'd admitted he hated those nights too, the house feeling empty without her presence. As winter gradually released its grip and spring began to green the hills, Nessa noticed changes in herself. She was tired more often, her stomach unsettled in the mornings. Her dresses began to feel tight around the waist. When she missed her monthly courses twice in a row, she knew. "I'm going to have a baby," she told Kieran one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, wonder, fierce joy. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I'm certain." Kieran pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe. "A baby, our baby. Nessa, you've made me the happiest man alive." "You're not worried?" she asked. "About the responsibility, the changes?" "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh, "but in the best possible way. We're going to be parents. We're going to have a family." They told everyone their news, receiving congratulations and advice from all quarters. Mrs. Chen immediately began knitting tiny garments, Morrison presented them with a wooden cradle he'd had stored in his attic. The ranch hands, Pete and Jim, started working on additions to the house without being asked, building a nursery onto the main structure. As spring turned to summer, Nessa's belly swelled with their growing child. She had to stop teaching as her pregnancy advanced, the school board firm about propriety, though she missed her students. Instead, she focused on preparing for the baby's arrival and continuing to make the ranch house into a home. One warm June afternoon, nearly a year after their first meeting, Nessa and Kieran finally made it back up the hillside to Sarah Mae's grave. Nessa moved more slowly now, her body ungainly with the baby she carried, but she was determined to see the flowers. The sight that greeted them took her breath away. The grave was a riot of color, wildflowers of every hue blooming in glorious profusion. Lupines raised purple spires toward the sky, while Indian paintbrush added splashes of red and orange. Yellow balsam root and white yarrow filled the spaces between, creating a living memorial more beautiful than any carved stone could be. "She would have loved this," Kieran said softly, his arm around Nessa's expanded waist. "Thank you for caring enough to make it happen." "Thank you for finding me here," Nessa replied. She leaned against him, one hand resting on her belly where their child moved and kicked, "for seeing my heart and claiming it." "I think you claimed mine first," Kieran said. He placed his hand over hers on her belly, his expression one of wonder as he felt their baby's movements. "Everything good in my life now started with you tending this grave. You brought love back into my world." They stood together on the hillside for a long time, surrounded by wildflowers and possibilities, their past and future intertwined. The baby kicked again, strong and insistent, and both of them laughed. "I think someone's ready to meet us," Nessa said. "Soon," Kieran agreed. "Very soon." Their son was born in late July during a thunderstorm that shook the ranch house and turned the sky electric. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the doctor from town and Mrs. Chen, who proved surprisingly knowledgeable about childbirth. Kieran paced outside the bedroom for hours, refusing to leave despite Pete and Jim's attempts to distract him with whiskey and cards. When the baby's first cry rang out, Kieran burst into the room despite propriety. He found Nessa exhausted but radiant, cradling a red-faced infant against her chest. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were already showing hints of green. "A son," the doctor announced, smiling. "Healthy and strong, congratulations." "He's perfect," Kieran breathed, approaching the bed slowly as though approaching something sacred. He reached out tentatively to touch the baby's tiny hand, and when the infant's fingers closed around his, Kieran felt tears stream down his face. "He's absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Nessa asked softly. Kieran gathered his son into his arms with infinite care, cradling the baby against his chest. The infant settled immediately, as though recognizing his father. "Hello, little one," Kieran murmured. "Welcome to the world. I'm your papa, and I promise I'll always keep you safe." They named him Thomas, after Nessa's lost brother, with the middle name of James after Kieran's father. Thomas James Sullivan made his presence known in the ranch house immediately, his lusty cries and demanding nature keeping his parents busy day and night. But neither Nessa nor Kieran would have traded a moment of it, even the sleepless nights and overwhelming responsibility. Nessa took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. She nursed Thomas while reading books, sang to him while working around the house, talked to him constantly as though he could understand every word. Kieran proved to be a devoted father, sneaking into the nursery multiple times a night just to watch his son sleep, carrying the baby around the ranch in a sling so Thomas could be near him while he worked. "You're going to spoil him," Pete warned good-naturedly, watching Kieran pace the barnyard with Thomas tucked against his chest. "Let me spoil him," Kieran replied. "He's only going to be this small once." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Nessa found herself longing to return to teaching. The school board had held her position, understanding that she'd need time with her baby, and when Thomas turned 2, she began working part-time. Kieran's mother had been right. The family they'd created together had become the center of everything, but that didn't mean Nessa couldn't also pursue the work she loved. Mrs. Chen, now elderly but still spry, helped care for Thomas on the days Nessa taught. The old woman doted on the boy, teaching him Chinese words alongside English ones and filling him with stories about her homeland. Thomas adored her, calling her grandmother Chen and insisting on holding her hand whenever they walked together in town. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered under Kieran's careful management, expanding gradually until the bar became one of the most successful operations in the region. Nessa's school continued to thrive, and she eventually became head teacher, overseeing 2 other instructors. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child with his father's green eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Every spring, the 3 of them would make the pilgrimage to Sarah Mae's grave, where the wildflowers bloomed faithfully year after year. Thomas loved the flowers, gathering small bouquets for his mother and asking endless questions about the aunt he'd never known. Kieran would tell stories about Sarah, keeping her memory alive for his son, and Nessa would tend the grave as she always had, with gentle care and respect. When Thomas was 4, Nessa discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. Their daughter arrived in the spring, during the season when the wildflowers bloomed. They named her Sarah, after Kieran's sister, with Nessa's mother's name, Margaret, in the middle. Sarah Margaret Sullivan had blonde hair like her mother and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone who met her. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, always watching over Sarah with protective devotion. He'd bring her toys when she cried, sing to her the songs his mother had sung to him, and announce to anyone who'd listen that he had the best baby sister in the world. "Our family is complete," Nessa said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas play with Sarah in the grass. The little girl was nearly 2 now, toddling after her brother with single-minded determination. "It's more than I ever dreamed of having," Kieran agreed. He pulled Nessa close, kissing her temple. "You've given me everything, you know, love, children, a real home. Before you came into my life, I was just surviving. Now I'm living." "We've given those things to each other," Nessa corrected. She thought back to that first afternoon on the hillside, when she'd been planting flowers for a stranger and a lonely rancher had stopped to watch. Everything had started there, with an act of simple kindness that had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting. The years continued their steady march. Thomas grew tall and strong, inheriting his father's way with horses and developing a deep love for the land. He started helping around the ranch as soon as he was old enough, learning the skills he'd need to eventually take over the bar. Sarah proved to be a talented student, devouring books and asking questions that sometimes stumped even her teacher mother. When she announced at age 12 that she wanted to be a doctor, Nessa and Kieran supported her ambition completely, even though few women pursued medicine. Pete and Jim eventually retired, replaced by younger ranch hands, though they stayed on the property in a cottage Kieran built for them. They became surrogate uncles to Thomas and Sarah, teaching them skills and telling stories about the old days. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 78, surrounded by the family she'd adopted. The whole town mourned her, and Nessa wept at the funeral for the loss of the woman who'd been like a mother to her. Morrison retired and sold the general store, though he remained in Central City, a fixture at Sunday church services and community events. He loved to tell anyone who'd listen about how he'd employed Nessa when she first arrived and how he'd known from the start that she was special. The story grew more embellished with each telling, but Nessa never corrected him. Central City itself grew and changed over the years. The mining played out eventually, but the town didn't die as so many others had. Instead, it transformed, becoming a regional center for the surrounding ranches and farms. More families arrived, drawn by reports of good land and fair dealings. The single schoolhouse became 3, then 5, providing education for children throughout the valley. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Kieran took Nessa back to the hillside where they'd met. Thomas, now 18 and managing much of the ranch's day-to-day operations, had arranged everything, handling his parents' duties so they could have the day to themselves. Sarah, 16 and preparing to leave for medical school back east, had packed them a picnic lunch with all their favorite foods. They rode up to Sarah Mae's grave on a perfect June afternoon, the sky vast and blue overhead. The wildflowers were at their peak, creating a carpet of color that stretched beyond the grave to cover much of the hillside. Over the years, the flowers had spread from seeds carried by wind and animals, until the entire area had become a meadow of blooms. "Look at this," Nessa marveled, dismounting to walk among the flowers. Her hair, now streaked with silver threads, caught the sunlight. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined it would be." "You did this," Kieran said, coming to stand beside her. He'd aged well, his face lined but strong, his body still lean and powerful despite years of hard work. "One small act of kindness, and look what grew from it." "We did this," Nessa corrected, taking his hand. "Together. Everything we have, everything we've built, started here with both of us." They spread their blanket near the grave and ate the lunch Sarah had prepared, talking about their children, the ranch, their hopes for the future. They reminisced about their early days together, laughing over mistakes they'd made and challenges they'd overcome. They spoke of people they'd lost and people they'd gained, of how their love had deepened over 2 decades into something unshakable and true. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked as they lay side by side on the blanket, watching clouds drift overhead. "Choosing this life instead of going back east, you could have had more opportunities there, more culture." "Never," Nessa said firmly. She rolled onto her side to face him, her hand resting over his heart. "This is where I was meant to be, with you. This is where I found everything I was looking for, even though I didn't know I was looking for it." "I love you," Kieran said, the words as heartfelt as the day he'd first spoken them. "More now than even then, if that's possible." "It's possible," Nessa assured him, "because I feel the same way." They stayed on the hillside until sunset, reluctant to leave this place that had brought them together. As they finally packed up their things and prepared to ride home, Nessa paused by Sarah Mae's grave, her hand resting on the sun-warmed stone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing him to me. For letting me care for you. I hope you're at peace, wherever you are." A breeze stirred the wildflowers, making them dance and sway, and Nessa chose to believe it was Sarah's spirit acknowledging her words. More years passed, bringing more changes. Sarah went east for medical school and became a skilled physician, eventually returning to Montana to practice in Helena. She married a fellow doctor, a kind man named Robert who loved her fierce intelligence and determination. Thomas married Julia, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they had 4 children who filled the Bar-S ranch house with noise and laughter. Kieran and Nessa became grandparents 8 times over, delighting in the chaos and joy of family gatherings. They remained active and involved, though they gradually turned more of the ranch operations over to Thomas. Nessa retired from teaching at 60, finally ready to rest after decades of shaping young minds. She took up painting instead, creating landscapes of the Montana hills she loved. On what would be their 40th wedding anniversary, tragedy struck. Kieran suffered a heart attack while working in the barn. Thomas found him and got him back to the house, and Sarah was sent for immediately, but everyone knew it was serious. For 3 days, Kieran lingered between life and death while Nessa sat by his bedside, holding his hand and refusing to leave. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes fully for the first time, focusing on her face. "Nessa," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "I'm here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here. Don't cry." He managed a small smile, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We've had a good life, a wonderful life. No regrets." "You're not leaving me," Nessa insisted, though she could see death hovering in his eyes. "You promised me a lifetime, Kieran Sullivan." "And I gave you one," he said. 40 years of happiness. Children, grandchildren, love. So much love, Nessa. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for seeing me that day on the hillside." "Thank you for seeing me," Nessa choked out. "For seeing my heart and claiming it." "Always yours," Kieran whispered. "Always." He closed his eyes then, his breathing becoming labored. The family gathered around the bed as Sarah made him as comfortable as possible. There was nothing more medicine could do. This was simply his time. Kieran Sullivan died as the sun set that evening, surrounded by everyone he loved. His last breath was a sigh, almost peaceful, and when Nessa looked at his face, she saw that he was smiling slightly, as though seeing something beautiful just beyond the veil. The grief was overwhelming. For weeks, Nessa moved through her days as though underwater, everything muted and distant. She'd lost half of herself when Kieran died, the part that had learned to hope and love again. Thomas and Sarah were endlessly patient with her, understanding that grief couldn't be rushed. Julia made sure she ate. The grandchildren hugged her and brought her flowers. Slowly, painfully, Nessa began to heal. She'd never stop missing Kieran, never stop wishing she could see his smile one more time or feel his arms around her. But she carried him in her heart, in her memories, in the family they'd created together. Every time she looked at Thomas, she saw Kieran's green eyes and gentle strength. Every time Sarah's laugh rang out, she heard echoes of her husband's joy. Spring came again, as it always did, and Nessa made the pilgrimage to Sarah Mae's grave. Thomas offered to come with her, but she needed to do this alone. She rode the path she'd traveled countless times, her aging body still remembering the way even after all these years. The wildflowers were blooming again, as faithful as ever, carpeting the hillside in waves of color. Nessa dismounted slowly and walked to the grave, where the stone had weathered but still stood strong. Next to it now was another stone, freshly carved, Kieran Sullivan, 1845–1891. Beloved husband and father. Thomas had arranged it, placing his father next to his aunt on the hillside Kieran had always loved. It was perfect, Nessa thought. She knelt between the two graves, her hands resting on both stones. "I brought you both flowers," she said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. "Though I suppose you don't need them. You have all these." She began pulling a few weeds that had sprung up, her movements automatic after so many years of tending these plots. As she worked, she talked to them both, telling Sarah about her namesake grandniece who'd become a doctor, telling Kieran about how well Thomas was managing the ranch. "He's so much like you," she said, her hand lingering on Kieran's stone. "Strong and kind and fair, you'd be so proud of him." "Of both of them, really. They're good people, our children. We did well." A breeze stirred the wildflowers, bringing with it the scent of grass and earth and growing things. Nessa closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face, and for just a moment she could almost feel Kieran's presence, as though he stood just behind her with his hand on her shoulder. "I'll come back," she promised. "Every spring, just like always. I'll tend your graves and watch the flowers bloom. And one day, not too far from now probably, I'll join you here. We'll be together again, the three of us on this beautiful hillside." She stayed until the sun began its descent, talking and remembering and allowing herself to feel the full weight of her grief and her gratitude. When she finally rose to leave, her knees protesting the movement, she felt lighter somehow. The grief would never fully leave, but it would become bearable. She would carry it alongside all the love and joy she'd known, weaving it into the fabric of her remaining days. The years continued. Nessa lived to see great-grandchildren born, to celebrate Thomas's 50th birthday, to watch Sarah receive awards for her contributions to medicine. She painted hundreds of landscapes, filling the ranch house walls and giving them as gifts. She wrote long letters to her grandchildren, filling them with family stories and wisdom hard-won. When she was 73, she began to feel her body failing. Not dramatically, just a gradual winding down, like a clock slowly running out of spring. She spoke to Thomas and Sarah, making sure they understood her wishes. She wanted to be buried on the hillside between Kieran and Sarah Mae where the wildflowers bloomed. "Of course, Mother," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Wherever you want." On a morning in late spring, Nessa woke feeling lighter than she had in years. She rose and dressed carefully, putting on her favorite blue dress that matched the one she'd worn at her wedding. She walked through the ranch house one last time, touching the walls she and Kieran had painted, running her fingers over the furniture they'd chosen together. Thomas found her in the rocking chair on the porch, looking out over the valley with a peaceful expression. At first he thought she was sleeping, but when he touched her shoulder, he knew. His mother had simply slipped away, leaving as gently as she'd lived. They buried Nessa Sullivan on the hillside on a day when the sun shone bright and the wildflowers were at their absolute peak. It seemed as though every person in Central City attended, along with ranchers and farmers from across the valley. They came to pay respects to a woman who'd taught their children, helped their families, and lived with grace and kindness through all her years. A simple stone marked her grave: Nessa Pearson Sullivan, 1851–1924. Beloved wife, mother, and teacher. She is remembered. The three graves stood together on the hillside, surrounded by flowers that bloomed faithfully every spring, spreading farther each year. Local people began calling it the Flower Hill, and it became a tradition for couples in love to visit, believing that the hillside held some special blessing for those who honored the three souls resting there. Thomas and Julia often walked up to visit, bringing their children and grandchildren to tell them about the grandmother who'd planted wildflowers for a stranger and found love in return. Sarah came whenever she was in the area, usually bringing fresh flowers even though the hillside provided its own. They kept the graves tended, making sure the stones stayed clean and the flowers had room to grow. The story of Nessa and Kieran became part of Central City's folklore, a reminder that love could bloom in unexpected places, and that small acts of kindness could change everything. Young couples would make the climb to Flower Hill and stand where Kieran had first seen Nessa kneeling by the grave, imagining their own futures together. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, eventually passing to his eldest son, and then to his grandson after that. Each generation added their own improvements while honoring the foundation Kieran and Nessa had built. The ranch house was expanded several times, but the original section was preserved, kept as a memorial to the couple who'd started it all. Sarah's medical practice thrived, and she became known throughout Montana for her skill and compassion. She established a scholarship fund for women pursuing medicine, naming it after her mother, ensuring that other women would have the opportunities Nessa had fought to give her daughter. On what would have been Nessa and Kieran's 75th wedding anniversary, their descendants gathered on Flower Hill for a reunion. Nearly 60 people climbed the hillside that day, ranging from small children to those with gray hair and wrinkled faces. They stood among the wildflowers, 3 generations connected by the love story that had started it all. Thomas, now elderly himself, stood by his parents' graves and told the story one more time. He spoke of a young woman from Philadelphia who'd found a forgotten grave and decided to care for it. He told of a lonely rancher who'd been amazed by her kindness and seen in her the possibility of love again. He described their courtship among the wildflowers, their wedding on a winter day, the family they'd built through work and devotion, and unwavering commitment to each other. "They taught us that love is both strong and gentle," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the assembled family. "That it can heal old wounds and create new possibilities, that it's worth fighting for, worth building on, worth honoring every single day. That's their legacy to us. Not just this land or these flowers, but the example of how to live with open hearts." As he finished speaking, a breeze swept across the hillside, making the wildflowers dance and sway. The family stood in silence, feeling the presence of those who'd come before, understanding in that moment the weight and beauty of the love that had brought them all into being. The wildflowers continued to bloom year after year, generation after generation, spreading across the hillside in waves of color that could be seen from the valley below. And every spring, someone from the Sullivan family would climb to Flower Hill to tend the 3 graves and tell the story of how it all began, with a woman planting wildflowers on a forgotten grave, with a rancher who saw her heart and claimed it, with love that bloomed as faithfully as the flowers themselves, enduring through seasons and years, creating beauty that would last forever.